Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the Heritage Talks online series. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm a project director for the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, otherwise known as QAN. And I'm also joined today by Glenn Patterson, who's also a project director. If you're unfamiliar with QAN, we are an organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular, Quebec's English-speaking communities spread right across the province. You are welcome to become a member of QAN, and membership is open to everyone, including community groups and heritage organizations. So please check out our website at qahn.org for more information about us. You can find out about our projects as well, including our beautiful publication called Quebec Heritage News. Quebec Heritage News magazine is available to all our members, and you can also discover the organizations that are out there right across the province. I would like to thank the funders who helped make this series possible, including Canadian Heritage, the Secretariat for Relations with English-Speaking Quebecers, the Chalkers Foundation, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. The Heritage Talks online series has a great lineup of researchers, writers, and historians, and you can discover the presentation dates and times of broadcast right here on our Heritage Talks Facebook page or by going to QAN's website. And you can join the Heritage Talks Facebook page and you don't have to have your own Facebook account. It's a public site, so you can just go there, or you can pre-register on Zoom. And all the links to join to the different series that are coming up are on the Facebook page, and you just click the links and you're in. Before I get started, I just wanted to let you know that we'll be accepting questions at the end of the evening. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the comment section on Facebook Live, and Glenn will take note of them and ask them to our speaker on your behalf. Or if you're on Zoom and you haven't played with Zoom before, you can just raise your hand, or there's the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen. So I'm very pleased to introduce you tonight to our guest speaker, Rod MacLeod. Rod is the current editor of Quebec Heritage News, and he's written extensively on the history of Montreal, particularly its cultural and educational institutions. He co-edited Montreal, the History of a North American City, McGill Queen's University Press in 2018, and he's completing High Ground, Mount Royal and the Rise of Anglo-Protestant Montreal, 1816 to 1884. Tonight, his presentation is called Crystal Gazing, Building Exhibition Spaces in Montreal, 1855 to 1882. And welcome, Rod.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thanks to Glenn and to everyone at QAN and to everyone here. I'm particularly happy to have an opportunity to present a topic that I've been working on a little bit this past year. I guess you could call it a COVID project. I apologize for the pun in the title. I realize I have to share my screen here so you can see what it is. There we are. Yeah. If you don't understand the pun, you'll get it, I hope, before too long. And I should probably have added in the subtitle that when I say exhibition spaces, I also mean performance spaces, but of course that would have made the title a little bit ungainly. So let's begin in ancient Greece. Where else? Well, when I say ancient Greece, I actually mean let's begin with a statue in ancient Greece, or actually a copy of an ancient Greek statue, the famous Discobolus, which you see here. So on a day in the autumn of 1874, Samuel Butler, the English novelist and social critic, who was in town on business, paid a visit to Montreal's Natural History Society museum. And while he was poking around, he discovered in one of its back rooms the Discobolus, which was there among, I quote, the skins, plants, snakes, insects, and an old man stuffing an owl. I assume the man in question was the custodian of the museum. Butler was outraged to find the Discobolus in a back room, as it were, out of sight. And it led to him writing this poem, which is commonly referred to as, "Oh God, oh Montreal," which is, of course, the refrain that keeps coming up. His whole point in this poem is to present Montreal as a cultural backwater, a city whose citizens were, quote, "too busy with commerce to care greatly about the masterpieces of old Greek art." And the poem is often cited as evidence that Montreal's movers and shakers were Philistines. Of course, one might as well argue that Butler was taking cheap shots at Montreal to support a larger criticism of Victorian society. One might also ask whether it was really likely that Montreal was any more of a cultural backwater than most Victorian cities of its size. And that's assuming that we can define what a cultural backwater is. In any case, Butler overlooked two significant realities. One was, that the Discobolus was in the back room of the Natural History Museum. So it's not particularly surprising that it would be there. The big takeaway from his visit should have been that Montreal had no permanent art museum where you might want to put something like a Discobolus. The other big takeaway that he doesn't seem to have realized was that since the middle of the 19th century, Montreal had been consumed by the idea of establishing cultural institutions, whether it was natural history, the fine arts, music, or what we might call the industrial or practical arts. So let's go back a little bit to 1855 with the arrival of John William Dawson at Montreal to be the new principal of McGill College. Dawson is clearly a key figure of this whole cultural movement that I've been talking about. He was a geologist from Pictou, Nova Scotia, and he had served for a long time as the superintendent of education in Nova Scotia. He was lured to Montreal, lured to take up his principalship at McGill, with the promise that he would also be able to head up the Department of Natural History at McGill. So there's, I'm sure, entirely apocryphal story, I might even say a somewhat Pythonesque story, of Dawson arriving at McGill and showing up in the secretary's office and saying, "Here I am," and asking, "Could I please be directed to the Department of Natural History?" And the secretary sort of hemmed and hawed and said, "Well, we don't, as such, actually have a Department of Natural History," which came as something of a blow to Dawson. And of course, his spirits sinking somewhat, he says, "Well, could you then direct me, please, to your collection of natural history objects?" And again, the secretary kind of hemmed and hawed and said, "Well, we don't, as such, have a collection of natural history objects. What we do have," and apparently he pulled out a drawer on his desk, "is a rock." As I say, somewhat Pythonesque. Dawson clearly had his work cut out for him, not only at McGill itself, but also in Montreal. And he clearly took the city by storm. I should point out here that there he is, nicely holding some kind of nautilus. Dawson is a very young man. We are most used to seeing him with an impressive beard. So he took the city by storm by joining Montreal's Natural History Society. You can see on the right the seal, or we could call it the logo of the Natural History Society. I find myself wondering whether that owl is in fact the one that Butler saw being stuffed. Perhaps not. Anyway, it's a very old society. It had been around since 1827. The membership of it was largely amateur, composed to a large extent of clergy, Protestant clergy mostly, doctors, businessmen. Almost all of them, as I say, were Protestant, and virtually all of them were Anglos, with a couple of exceptions. And this shouldn't entirely be surprising, since at this time the city's movers and shakers were mostly of British origin. Dawson clearly impressed the membership. At its next annual general meeting in May of 1856, he was elected president of the society. And you can see the front page of the annual report of that particular meeting. So Dawson set to work, and through some of his contacts that he'd established prior to coming to Montreal, he arranged for the American Association for the Advancement of Science to hold their annual meeting at McGill. And this was the very first time that this particular association had held a meeting outside the United States. So they came in the fall of 1857. And apparently it was a very successful meeting, and everyone was very impressed with the facilities available. The Natural History Society at this time had a very small museum on St. James Street in what is now Old Montreal, a museum that was divided into four modest departments: mineralogy, botany, zoology, and miscellaneous. Miscellaneous, of course, containing coins and documents and plaster casts, all things that arguably didn't really have a place in a natural history museum. Membership really felt that it was time to expand the collection and to expand the museum, and ideally to relocate this museum in the new town. And I will explain to you what I mean by the new town. Here is a map from 1846, so a good 10 years before what I'm talking about. You can get a sense, this whole area up here is generally what's referred to as the new town. This map depicts it in its early planning stages, and you can see a lot of it is laid out in the geometrical form with straight streets, and everything's divided into building lots. Of course, by 10 years later, there'd been a lot of infill. Here, down here in the lower right corner, is the old town of Montreal, what we would now call Old Montreal. So there's this tension that I'm going to keep coming back to between the old town and the new town. There's McGill College way at the top, and I should point out that this all the lands belonging to McGill College stretch all the way down well below Sherbrooke Street. McGill itself served as a draw for other institutions, including schools and churches. All these, excuse me, these institutions that wanted, good thing I'm not screaming. They wanted to take advantage of the new town's broad streets, the cleaner air, and the respectable families that lived there. So McGill was in the process of madly selling off its land below Sherbrooke Street. And here you can see a map from the 1850s. And on this map, you can see elements of some of the elegant terraces, row houses for well-to-do families that were being erected during this period. You can also see Christ Church Cathedral, which of course had been relocated there as well. Building contractors of all sorts were putting up these terraces, and the terraces all had fancy names. The contractors themselves, who often made quite a bit of money out of this endeavor, very often typically ended up living too in the terraces, and so they too became residents of the new town. Here's a case in point, part of the new town landscape, terraced housing. There you have what was called Mount Royal Terrace on McGill College Avenue, which was built in 1858. Again, just the time when everything is happening. It was built by a contractor called Henry Bulmer. Henry Bulmer, who's came from a family of bricklayers, but who had diversified into construction and, in fact, real estate speculation, and he did very well out of it. So if you wanted to get real estate from McGill, the go-to person was James Ferrier, who was the head of the McGill College Finance Committee. And that sounds really dull, I know. But Ferrier is a very important person in 19th century Montreal, and he was clearly one of the most influential people at McGill. He was a wealthy hardware merchant. He was a railway investor. He was a former mayor of Montreal. And I heard someone in a recent conference refer to him as the most corrupt man in Montreal, which tells you something, perhaps. I'd like to know more about exactly why that was. So Ferrier was the person to talk to, and of course Dawson, who was also the principal, was a natural person to negotiate. And the two of them worked out a very nice deal. And I'm showing you a close-up of that map from 1846 that I showed you before, where very little is built, nothing is built here, so you can get a clearer sense of what's going on. Here's the lot way down at the bottom, two lots, in fact, that McGill leased to the Natural History Society for its new museum. It was a good arrangement. McGill got a museum in its midst, and the Society also got a great new site. Two lots, as I say, on the corner of Cathcart and University. So the Natural History Museum, the Natural History Society Museum, I should call it, on University Street, was begun in the fall of 1858. Here's some shots of it, of course, after it was finished. There's its facade on the left, a modest looking building, one might say, but I think it was definitely a credit to the area. And on the right, of course, you can see the interior, which is a design on 2 floors, exhibits down below and also up above on the mezzanine. And any of you who know the Redpath Museum today, which I hope I will get to before the end of the evening, it's rather similar. And I think this was kind of a design that was quite popular, an idea that was certainly coming about how to display things in interior spaces. As I say, construction started in October of 1858, and almost immediately, James Ferrier, having completed his negotiations, left on a trip to Egypt. So the following February in 1859 found Ferrier and his family and some friends near Thebes. And I quote from a diary entry at this time. He says, "In the afternoon, we went to see the mummies, which we afterwards purchased. In the evening, we went to Luxor and called on Mustafa Aga, the consul." And Ferrier acquired these Theban mummies under what I think we would now call rather dubious circumstances. I believe that Aga was generally considered a dealer as well. But this mummy, or several mummies, were shipped back and presented to the Natural History Society. And they were opened for the first time, on view for the first time, in the course of the official inauguration of the museum in October of 1859. I would like to make a reference right now, thanks to Barbara Lawson, who was a curator at the Redpath Museum for much of this information. Okay. There were a lot of other people at this time, or perhaps I could say a lot of the same people wearing different hats, who were beginning to think along much grander lines than one small museum. So a key player in all of this was, in fact, the Mechanics Institute of Montreal. The Mechanics Institute had also been around for quite some time. Its mandate was to promote popular education, practical skills. You'll notice on the right, its logo, if you like, all of these objects of practical crafts and industry The Institute offered a regular program of public lectures. Dawson was a frequent speaker at these events. Now, the Mechanics Institute of Montreal just acquired a new headquarters on St. James Street in 1853. It wasn't necessarily thinking of moving to the new town. But this new headquarters included a small museum. It was a museum featuring tools, scientific instruments, models of invention, a collection of things that spoke to the dignity of work and the spirit of industry that one was seeing in the Victorian city at this time. The Mechanics Institute of Montreal participated in a number of industrial exhibitions, beginning with, of course, London's Great Exhibition of 1851, which was held in an architecturally innovative structure known as the Crystal Palace and located in Hyde Park. There was a great deal of coverage, especially in the Montreal Gazette. The Gazette reporters came back glowing about the Crystal Palace and suggesting very strongly that Montreal should consider having its own exhibition space of this sort. It is not perhaps surprising that one of the main promoters of what became the Crystal Palace project in Montreal was a man by the name of Brown Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a lawyer and a journalist and one of the publishers of the Montreal Gazette. He was a member of the Mechanics Institute, and he would go on to be a member of Parliament. And I should cite here that one of the sources on the life of Brown Chamberlain is an article written by our very own Heather Darch, Brown Chamberlain, Missisqua's first member of Parliament, which is, as I say, what he would become. But to our purposes, he was the big promoter of this idea of having a museum of what they were calling industrial and fine arts in Montreal. So all of this buzz around industrial exhibitions inspired the provincial government, and when I say provincial government, I mean the government of Canada at this time, to create in 1857 the board, or rather the boards of arts and manufactures, one board for Canada East, one board for Canada West. This is all part of the growing interest in practical education. It's no coincidence that at the same time, the normal schools were created. So the mandate of the Board of Arts and Manufactures was, and I quote, to promote the development of mechanical talent among the people of this province by disseminating instruction in mechanics and the kindred sciences, and by affording increased facilities for the study of models and apparatus. Of course, there was a big advocacy of vocational training. And interestingly, it was vocational training for women as well as for men. And you can see again in their logo here, this is illustrated. On the left, you have a man with an anvil and a hammer. And on the right, you have a woman holding a tablet, a slate perhaps, and I guess an amphora in the background, suggesting perhaps ceramics or food. In any event, sort of equal time here. The board's bylaws specified that Montreal should have, and I quote, museums of minerals and other material substances and chemical compositions susceptible of being used in mechanical arts and manufactures, with rooms appropriately supplied with models of works of art and of implements and machines, and free libraries of references containing books, plans, and drawings selected with a view to the imparting of useful information. Yes, the Victorians knew how to write, or perhaps they didn't really know how to write. The person in charge of this museum that the bylaws were clearly recommending the creation of would be the secretary of the board. So all of this kind of stuff was exactly the kind of thing that the Mechanics Institute was fascinated by. It had great appeal. The Mechanics Institute of Montreal sends 22 delegates to the Board of Arts and Manufactures first meeting in July 1857. I say sends in quotes because the meeting was actually held in the Mechanics Institute building in Montreal. So I guess they went upstairs. So, you know, that's not much of a trip. The board was, the board was a large and unwieldy body, but its governance, this is kind of unusual, but that's the way they did it. The governance was in the hands of an 11-member subcommittee, as they called it. And the Mechanics Institute of Montreal really ran the show. 8 out of the 11 members of the subcommittee were members of the Montreal Mechanics Institute, and 3/4 of the executive were from the Mechanics Institute in Montreal. And these included people like Henry Bulmer, whom I mentioned before as one of the builders of terraces. Bulmer had in fact been the president of the Mechanics Institute of Montreal from 1852 to 1856. And also David Brown, who was also a building contractor at this time, and he would become the president of the Board of Arts and Manufactures from 1858 to 60. Another member of the subcommittee was no less than Dawson, principal of McGill, who was not a member of the Mechanics Institute, but he, of course, participated often in their programs. And interestingly, the vice president of the board was Pierre-Joseph Olivier Chauveau. Chauveau was currently the superintendent of education of Canada East, and he would later become Quebec's first premier. He was the only francophone on the subcommittee, and in fact, he was the only non-Montrealer on the subcommittee. So who became secretary? Well, obviously it was Brown Chamberlain, because he wanted to use the office of secretary to really promote the museum. Remember that the bylaws specified that the person in charge of the museum would be the secretary. So on his suggestion, the board paid for him, Chamberlain, to travel abroad between May and October of 1858 to study industrial museums. Well, you know, nice work if you can get it. So he traveled all around the British Isles and parts of the continent, but one of the most important visits that he made was to what was called then the South Kensington Museum, which had formerly been known as the Museum of Manufactures. This is a direct spin-off of the Crystal Palace exhibition in London. And we know it today, of course, as the Victoria and Albert Museum. But this is a museum that had tremendous impact all around the world on museums of industrial arts and decorative arts and things of that sort, to a certain extent on the fine arts. Chamberlain came back from this visit absolutely convinced that Montreal had to actually hold an industrial exhibition, that it would, you know, draw people to the city, draw attention to the city, and it would lead to this permanent museum that everybody was talking about. Not only that, but it needed to be a crystal palace. There was an opportunity that presented itself, as well as a deadline that presented itself, in that the Prince of Wales was scheduled to visit the city in August of 1860 to open up the Victoria Bridge, which of course was the 8th wonder of the world, as everyone called it at the time. The Prince of Wales at this time was 18, and you can see him there on the right. And I will make no comment, but his visit was eagerly anticipated. But as I say, it provided a deadline for, which is often very helpful, for the whole Crystal Palace project to come together. Where were they going to build the Crystal Palace? Well, obviously in the new town. And I'm showing you here a map from 1872. So this is a good dozen years after it was built. But you can see here, right here in the middle of this large lot, also occupied by the Natural History Society Museum. There it is, running between St. Catherine Street and Cathcart Street, with its more or less front-facing up Victoria Street, which runs right there. Of course, this being McGill land, there was required the inevitable negotiation with James Ferrier, and again, Dawson proved very useful here. May not come as any surprise that in January of 1860, after some of this negotiation had gone on, Dawson was elected the president of the Board of Arts and Manufactures. I will also point out that south of Cathcart Street, facing the south gate of the what would become the Crystal Palace here, is this row of terraces right here called St. George's Place. And at one of these was the home of Brown Chamberlain. In fact, one of the other houses was the home of Henry Bulmer, who had built the terrace. As I say, the terrace builders often ended up living on their terrace. And David Brown, who originally the president of the Board of Arts and Manufactures, lived just around the corner. So it may be no coincidence that all of these key influential people lived very close to this site. So in order to build this structure, they needed an architect, of course, and they turned to one of the city's premier architects, John William Hopkins, who designed a Crystal Palace modeled very closely on the London prototype, although as it turned out, there was a good deal more brick in its construction, which was perhaps inevitable given Montreal winters. They wanted this to last. But there was enough steel structure to allow for very large windows, so there was still a lot of natural light. You can see here, again, that same model, a ground floor, but also up above mezzanines. You can see in the map, in the plan here, this shows you the outline of the mezzanine where some of the exhibits would have been and the stairs leading up to it. So they had their architect and they had their design, and they needed to have something to put in the museum. So the Board of Arts and Manufacturers, let's call it Chamberlain, sent out a kind of a flyer calling for objects that they identified as things that they wanted to put in the exhibition. The call went out right across Canada East to all kinds of mechanics institutes and other institutions. And here is the cover page of the flyer, if you like, the Grand Exhibition of the Industrial Products of United Canada, et cetera, et cetera. And they listed all kinds of things that they wanted in all kinds of objects in different categories, things made out of wood, things made out of metal, textiles, leather, things along those lines, all what we might call industrial arts. There was also a section, and I've shown you a bit of it here, on the fine arts. So clearly there was a place for the fine arts, sculpture and statuary and so forth in the Crystal Palace and in the exhibition. And I also draw attention to the fact that there was a ladies' department. Ladies' department containing such things as, I guess, feminine activities, painting, sketching, drawing, and mapping, as well as preserved dried leaves and flowers, laces, fringes, and trimmings, knitting, netting, and crochet work, quilts, counterpanes, curtains, and covers, and written composition, words with music, all things that respectable women could do and could contribute to the exhibition, which is interesting. There was room at this exhibition for the work of women, women creators. Also an indication that the museum and the exhibition would be a respectable space where women and families could visit. This is important. But on the subject of fine arts, with all of this in the air, in January of 1860, anticipating the creation of the Crystal Palace, the Art Association of Montreal was founded. A little bit of background to the Art Association. There had been an attempt by a group of artists in 1847 to put on an exhibition, which met with some success. And then in 1857, 10 years later, on the occasion of the American scientists that Dawson had invited, they put on a fairly successful show. But efforts really got underway at the beginning of 1860 with one eye on the Crystal Palace in the works. So members of this association included both collectors and artists, and I guess what you could call amateur connoisseurs. The artists included people like William Raphael, and I've included a painting by him on this slide behind Bon Secours Market, just for you to have something nice to look at. Also Charles Jones Way, another artist that I'm particularly but I give attended the early meetings of the Art Association as the rep of the but he stayed on, actually a very ill and active member of the Art Association for many, many years. He promoted in this capacity the idea that the Art Association and its collection would have a permanent home in the Crystal Palace and in the permanent museum that was going to be. The Art Association had a kind of trial run that they held at Nordheimer's Music Hall in May of 1860. This is still somewhat in existence down there in old Montreal. It's now incorporated into a fancy hotel complex, but you will ascend it. Nordheimer a very exhibit a conversazione, and I will keep using this Italian.
Hey Rod, we're having some technical difficulties here. I'm wondering if maybe if you tried turning off your video just for a bit.
To show off what they had.
Okay, give that a try. We'll just use audio just for a bit and we'll put on your video after. Thanks. My apologies, everyone.
So as its name suggests, a most prominent venue.
My apologies to everyone here. I'm just trying to sort out these technical difficulties. Rod, I'm not sure if anyone else in your house might be on the internet right now. It might be a good time to ask them to stop. You could also try rejoining the Zoom call. I know it's a bit of a risk, but maybe let's just try your audio for a second again there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really choppy, really choppy.
Can you do that?
Maybe
just
Heather, why don't you come on for a second and
because I'm all plugged in and everything.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk a little bit about upcoming Heritage Talks just for a sec. Rod, it could be your internet. I remember it was a bit intermittent the other week at the meeting. So maybe we'll just stall for a couple minutes. If you want, you could try rejoining the Zoom call. You might have a better connection. It's been great up until all of a sudden it was deteriorating. So let's talk about other upcoming Heritage Talks, Heather.
Yeah, for sure. You can hear me all right?
No problem.
Okay, great. Well, next week we have a talk called Mr. Albee Comes to Canada.
And exit? You want me to exit? Is that...
Whoops.
Yeah, try that, Rod.
It's by Grant Myers, who's our own president of the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. So that's going to be on Tuesday, February 16th from 7 to 8. And again, you can join by the links on our Facebook page, or just come to the Heritage Talks Facebook page and you'll see that live as well. And it should be a really interesting talk. Grant is an historian and a very good speaker. And he's going to be talking about Mr. Now I don't know if I can say his name right, Grant, Eliezer Albee of Rockingham, Vermont. And he died in Stansted, Quebec in 1864. And he left a very interesting epitaph on his stone that talked about exile and bitter disappointment in the country of his birth. So the talk is going to explore what we know about Mr. Albee's life and his reasons for coming to Canada during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. So that's next week on Tuesday. So hopefully you'll be able to join us.
We have a few more coming up, but I'll mention another Quan project in the works, which is I directed a musical heritage project last year. And one of the outcomes of that is some people we got to network with around Valcartier, Shannon, north of Quebec City, where they have a rich musical heritage. There's a young woman there who's sort of a, she's a filmmaker, photographer, and just interested in the local heritage. And she's produced a video documentary about the local musical heritage there. So we're going to have a premiere of that film, which she worked on as part of the Different Tune project. It'll be in mid-March. We don't have a date yet, but stay tuned for that, especially if you're interested. And maybe not a lot of people know about those communities north of Quebec City, but they have a very rich history and interesting area, and music's been a big part of their cultural life. So I see Rod rejoining here. Rod, welcome. Turn on, here, I'll ask you to unmute and turn your video. Let's just start with your audio. Let's see how that sounds. You there, Rod?
Now here I am, 1, 2, 3, testing.
Hey, it's all good to go. Sorry about that. So share your screen and as you were.
Oh, it's the delights of doing all this stuff.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
It's good to have a halftime show. Okay, hopefully this will work. Yes, so I was introducing you to Nordheimer's Music Hall, and which is the place where the Art Association had its sort of trial run conversazione. Yes, and I was going to say that this worked well for collectors and artists. Collectors realized that allowing your private collection to be seen by the public was both an act of philanthropy and also a way to show what great taste you had. So this was a mutually beneficial. Artists, of course, got exposure, and they were usually quite glad to share their works. As I was saying, that Nordheimer's Music Hall is also the city's leading performance space, rivaled only perhaps by the auditorium in the Mechanics Institute. And there was an article on this subject in the recent winter Quebec Heritage News. I'm just doing a little plug there. Nordheimer's was a favorite venue for the Montreal Oratorio Society, which had been established just the previous fall in September 1859. And Robert J. Fowler, who was a music teacher at the high school, was the conductor. Now, the Crystal Palace was not necessarily intended to be a concert venue, but the Oratorio Society, for example, did want to be part of the exhibition. Another important person, where am I here? Yes, in this light is the Anglican Bishop of Montreal, Francis Fulford. Whoops, yeah. Who is, one could definitely put in the category of an amateur connoisseur. Fulford was the first president of the Art Association. He was also the honorary president of the Oratorio Society, which was otherwise sort of managed by James Ferrier and members of his family. You'll recall that Fulford was also the president of the Natural History Society at the time that Dawson joined a few years earlier. So, with the prospect of building the Crystal Palace, the board, again, Chamberlain, decided it was a good idea to approach the city of Montreal to get some funding. Now, the city council is often depicted as being somewhat hostile to the whole idea of the Crystal Palace project. The argument is that the city council was largely francophone and it wanted the exhibition held in a francophone area. Well, in point of fact, the City Council of Montreal was not largely francophone. It was probably marginally more anglophone than francophone in its composition, but it obviously shared some of the divisions that one sees in society. In fact, the council was keen on giving $20,000 to the Board of Arts and Manufacturers to help build its structure. And it assigned a special committee to negotiate with the board. And at the head of this committee was a boot and shoe manufacturer by the name of Edward Thompson. Again, obviously an Anglophone. Now the committee under Thompson suggested a very different venue for the Crystal Palace. Now this map, this is also the map from 1872, and you can see down here the Chateau Ramezay, just east of Jacques Cartier Square, and across the street is this site, which was often referred to as the government garden because it was owned by the provincial government. It had been the headquarters of the Jesuit order, and it would go on to be the site of Montreal's City Hall. But at the time, it was simply vacant land, and this was where Thompson suggested the Crystal Palace be built. Thompson and Chamberlain got into quite a bit of a nasty spat over this point. One of the suggestions was that, or one of the problems is that the city would have to purchase this land from the provincial government, and that would take extra time to negotiate that. And Chamberlain said, we don't have time, we want to start building, so please make up your mind. And he gave them an ultimatum, and in the long run, there was a vote at the city council, which really largely due to a technicality, went in favor of Thompson's insistence that if it was not on this site, the board would get no money at all. So having decided this by the very, very narrow, slim majority, razor sharp majority, Chamberlain basically said, sorry, we're going to build where we want to build, and even if we don't get any money to help us out. Historians have often presented this debate as a case of the Anglo elite being very arrogant, and this is partly true in the sense that Chamberlain and the Board of Arts and Manufacturers were dead set on the new town site. But the choice was not between an Anglophone part of town and a Francophone part of town. It was a choice between an old town site, the old town increasingly identified as congested and commercial, and a new town site, the new town increasingly identified with culture and learning and respectability. So even without urban city funding, the Crystal Palace took shape during the central months of 1860. There were inevitable delays. The board kept running out of money. It had to borrow £3,000 from McGill itself. And it was only when the building was finally completed on the 4th of August that McGill signed a lease for the land, which seems like a bit of a strange arrangement, but they were holding their cards close to their chest. I guess I should say Ferrier was holding his cards close to his chest. The terms that are outlined in the lease are very typically Victorian, and they specified that the Crystal Palace could only be used to promote what they called the practical sciences and the arts. It should not be used as, quote, a theater, a tavern, saloon, or other like place of entertainment, and it would never, ever be open to the public on Sunday. Fortunately, the Prince of Wales arrived on a Saturday. which was lucky for all concerned. Now, the Prince of Wales' visit is extremely well documented, both as an account and also in terms of illustrations. Coverage appears in all kinds of international publications, the Illustrated London News, Harper's Weekly, and Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, from which we get some of the best illustrations. When the prince arrived at 9 a.m. at Bon Secours Wharf, he was greeted by the mayor underneath this elaborate triumphal arch that had been established on the wharf. And he was whisked, the prince was whisked into a carriage and escorted up into the new town, passing underneath a whole series of 8 equally triumphant arches positioned all around town. And this, the last one that he came across, which was on St. Catherine Street, very close to the Crystal Palace, had as its motto over the arch, appropriately, arts, manufacture, and commerce. So this was a social event, the social event of the season. Tickets were issued. Tickets were perhaps hard to come by. Imagine an inauguration in which there were more people than they knew what to do with. Here we have an actual ticket to the opening of the provincial exhibition, industrial exhibition in Montreal. This is made out to a certain T.M. Bryson, Esquire, and 2 ladies. So who the 2 ladies were that Mr. Bryson decided to bring, we don't know. But there's Brown Chamberlain's signature as the secretary at the bottom, making this an official document. The inauguration took place at 11 o'clock in the morning when the prince arrived at the Crystal Palace. There's a wonderful image of the Crystal Palace. I suspect considerably fancier looking than it actually was, because everything looks a little bit fancier than it actually was, but this gives you something of a flavor of it. And as it does inside, here's a depiction of the huge crowd gathered where the prince is doing the official opening. You can see from this illustration that the crowd includes a large number of bonneted ladies. They were referred to as the fair ones of Montreal, not condescending at all. But again, reminding us that this Crystal Palace is intended to be a respectable and a proper place for ladies and families to visit. The prince was toured around by Chamberlain himself. Dawson was the president, but he took over when the prince arrived at the collections of botany and paleontology. Dawson explained what was going on there. And when the prince got to the fine arts section, Fulford, who was the president of the Art Association, toured him around some of the paintings. And at one point, rather graciously said, invited the prince to select an object for it as a gift. And I think very carefully coached. The prince chose a painting by Charles Jones Way, whom I mentioned before, painting entitled "The Prince's Squadron at Anchor at the Mouth of Gaspé Basin." You have to imagine Way at least sketching the scene of the prince arriving at Gaspé and then hurrying back to Montreal and creating a painting that could be presented 2 weeks later at the time that the prince arrived at Crystal Palace. Anything for a visiting monarch, of course. I don't have an illustration of that painting. It's, I guess, at Windsor Castle or something at the moment. But anyway. I should add that Professor Fowler and his Montreal Oratorio Society entertained the gathering with a resounding chorus of, well, the Hallelujah chorus, to put a tap on the entire event. So despite all of these headaches, the industrial exhibition in the Crystal Palace would continue for its run throughout the rest of 1860, and I think could generally be considered a success. But of course, the question is, can this success be sustained? Well, no. The Board of Arts and Manufactures was in debt. It couldn't keep the exhibition going beyond the end of the year. The following year, it ended up renting the Crystal Palace out to the British garrison. The following year and the year after, some of the provincial agricultural exhibitions were held there. So it continued to have something of a shelf life, but not at all the museum that they were hoping for, perhaps if they'd had a little bit more funding and time. By 1865, Chamberlain devised a plan to sell the Crystal Palace to the Art Association, who were still kind of struggling. But the question arose as to who owned the Crystal Palace. Was it McGill? Was it the board? Was it the provincial government that got involved? It led to a huge dispute that dragged on and on and on, and didn't, of course, do the institution any good at all. But I think it's fair to say, I mean, this is a somewhat famous photograph by Notman of the Crystal Palace in 1866. And it often appears when people want to talk about how neglected and sort of sad the Crystal Palace has become by this point. But I don't know. I mean, it's obviously taken in November when nothing looks great. And being an old photograph, of course, you can't see any people. So inevitably, any street scene is going to look a little bit drab. I would argue that the Crystal Palace remained a potentially workable structure at least right through the 1860s. And it also continued to inspire. Here's that same 1872 map, and you can see the Crystal Palace down here. And just above it, on the north side of St. Catherine Street, you can see this block identified as John Fold's. This at one point had been a row of terraced housing, but John Fold's bought it up. He was a dry goods merchant who had been recently very successful at, I'm not entirely sure what, but he obviously had money to spend, because he overhauled the entire row of houses and opened up the street level as 9 independent shops, one of some of the earliest shops to appear in the new town. This photograph is from somewhat later. It doesn't give you an exact picture of what it looked like, but it gives you a sense. In the central part here, upstairs, Fold's built a performance space, I guess a concert hall, which he referred to as Queen's Hall, to rival Nordheimer's down in the old town. Also on the second floor, just next, it's over on this side, on the east, an institution called the Academy of Deportment and Dancing. The Academy of Deportment and Dancing was run by a very curious individual who went by the name of Senior J. Hazazer. Senior Hazazer, and with the magic of Google, I was able to trace him in the most extraordinary places. He seems to have had a history, having started presumably in Brazil, although that's far from being a sure thing, a history of appearing in the most unlikely places, in Minnesota, in Newfoundland, in Nanaimo, where he seems to have run academies and then left town. So I don't know what was going on. But he stayed in Montreal for a few years, and he ran what must be a very successful place where the offspring of the rich and famous could learn deportment, learn how to dance. In this illustration here, we see them all attending a masked ball. And I must say that when I looked at this illustration for the first time, I was sort of struck by the fact that everyone's wearing a mask, which seemed oddly surprising. Success on the whole, except unfortunately in March of 1874, there was a fire that did significant damage to Queen's Hall. That's next door to the building, the room you're looking at. And Fold's, partly because Montreal went into a huge depression at this point, he had to declare bankruptcy. Hazazer, I should say Senior Hazazer, soldiered on for a little bit. But then one day, the following winter, this adjoining wall collapsed, injuring some of the students in the academy. Hazazer promptly left town. We catch up to him, though, I should add, in Baltimore, where in 1880 he published a work by which I guess he's as famous as he is, if he is. The work is entitled Dancing and Deportment, Senior J. Hazazer's Guide for Young Beginners on Entering Society, Whether They Dance or Not. That's the title of his book. Anyway, that was temporarily the end of the story of the Queen's Hall, but just around the corner in 1875, Hugh Allen, the shipping magnate, built something called the Academy of Music on Victoria Street. This was something of a personal project. Despite the Depression, the very wealthy Hugh Allen did not seem to mind entirely bankrolling the cost of this other hall. And he staffed the board with members of his family. It was a 2,100 seat auditorium, and the Canadian Illustrated News praised it for its seating, its sight lines, and its electric lighting. And it said, I quote, "Montreal may now pride itself on the possession of a fine theatre, where the fashion can display itself to its heart's content." So clearly the real purpose of theater was to allow people to be seen in the audience. And then what did Allen do? But he took over the ruins of the Queen's Hall on St. Catherine Street, rebuilt it as a new Queen's Hall, which was another almost as large auditorium, which opened in 1880. The Depression had taken its toll on all kinds of musical organizations. The Oratorial Society had folded, and other groups like the Montreal Philharmonic Society, which began in the 60s, and the Mendelssohn Choir were pretty much stagnating. But with the opening up of these new facilities, the Queen's Hall, the new Queen's Hall, and the Academy of Music, they found a home and they proceeded to thrive. So, oh yes, sorry, I forgot to show you the Academy of Music. Again, a very fanciful depiction. I'm sure it wasn't quite that elaborate, but 2,100 seats, that's a lot. So the Art Association of Montreal continued to have its exhibitions. They had held them every 1 or 2 years, right through the 1860s, in various venues about town. It still had no permanent home. It still had no permanent collection. The exhibitions were essentially an occasion for the collectors to show off what they had and for artists to intrigue the public with what they had to offer. On the right here, you can see a list from the catalog of what was there. And I mean, I won't take the time. I mean, list the painters, and you can see that some of them, the painters, are also the contributors because they were contributing their own work just to make a name for themselves. The enthusiasm was generally gradually waning, I think. Fulford died in 1868. Chamberlain became a member of Parliament and went off to live in Ottawa, and he married an artist, which was interesting. The presidency of the Art Association was taken over by Peter Redpath, who continued this tradition of having exhibitions, but then the Depression hit in 1873, and the association pretty much stopped functioning, stopped the exhibitions, stopped even meeting. But everything changed in 1877 when the longtime member of the Art Association, Benaiah Gibb, died. Now Gibb, and I quote, "erected for himself a monument more durable than marble by bequeathing his very sizable personal art collection of at least 78 works to the city of Montreal, to be held in trust by the Art Association. He also donated a lot of land and $8,000 for maintenance, which is very important if you're leaving money. Again, I show you the 1872 map to show you where there in blue is the lot on the corner of Phillip Square and St. Catherine Street, where the Art Association would be built. Gibb left some very specific instructions about the museum's design. Clearly, he had a long experience through his association with the Art Association in how to put on exhibitions. The building should be, he specified, 80 feet by 60 feet. And a bit like the Queen's Hall project there, it would have shops on the street level, but on the second floor, it would have galleries. And because there would be skylights, the galleries would be equipped with natural lighting. And I'll just quickly show you a couple of photographs from the time. And you can see that this wonderful natural lighting was thanks to the specifications of Benaiah Gibb. The clutter on the walls is, I guess, an expression of typical Victorian preferences for their art exhibitions. I never understand how anybody can appreciate paintings when there's that much clutter, but nevertheless, that's what they liked. So 1879, we see the Art Association Gallery. The Crystal Palace is still functioning. It is occasionally a venue for very large social events, very typically regular exhibitions by the Montreal Horticultural Society, and you can see a slide of that here from 1877. But it hadn't really done what it was set out to do. There was no industrial arts museum that came of it. It was also located on prime real estate. And after all of that fuss over the ownership, the government eventually decided that it would move it to a new location in Mile End, where it thrived for a great many years before, unfortunately, burning by the end of the century. So the Crystal Palace is often presented as something of a sad story, but I think you have to consider what the building inspired at a very critical time in Montreal's, let's call it, cultural history. By way of a coda, I will mention the Redpath Museum, and this was Dawson finally getting his own natural history museum, which was based largely on his own collection of natural history objects, thanks to Peter Redpath, who donated the money for this new museum on the McGill grounds. And I'm happy to mention that the Natural History Society, when it finally closed, sent the Discobolus to its proper home in the Art Association. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rod. Heather, why don't you come on now too?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rod. That was fantastic. And some of those images that you showed tonight were amazing. I haven't seen an inside shot of the Crystal Palace like that, and the McCord Museum. And of course, it was great to hear about Brown Chamberlain as well. Thank you for that. Always nice to hear about a local Missisquoi guy doing well. Are there any questions from our community that are out there on either Zoom or on Facebook?
Nothing so far on Facebook. Lots of encouraging words for Rod, but I was, if anyone here on Zoom wants to ask a question, just turn on your mic and your video. And I see Sheila Glover's mic is on. I don't know if she has a question, but you're welcome if you like.
And say it again.
I'd like to thank Rod for the presentation. It was just marvelous and enlightening.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to enlighten. Don't you wish you could perform in some of those venues?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I was hoping to hear that that's exactly what happened, but I guess not.
Well, let me add that the Academy of Music was where the Mikado had its Montreal premiere in 1886. And not at all coincidentally, everybody in town who was anybody dressed up as characters from the Mikado, including Hugh Montague Allen, who's the eldest son of Hugh Allen, and the photographs of him all done up in his fancy Japanese outfit. Ladies, of course, would flock to Notman
Not
Studio.
Hollywood then.
No, not Bollywood. They flocked to, these are all inside comments here. They would flock to Notman Studio to get themselves photographed with in Japanese costumes. And there's a wonderful one of those composite Notman photos that shows. I used to think it was fantastic because it was a huge stage, must have been about 200 feet tall. But now that I've seen some of the images of the inside of the Academy of Music, I wonder whether maybe it was that big. But anyway, those are not venues that most of us spend a lot of time in.
Right.
Rod, when the Zoom was being readjusted, I dashed out to my own computer and Googled up Ferrier. I thought he looked like an interesting dude, but his successor was the exact opposite. He was a scallawag, and the James Easton Mills was a saint.
Who was the successor at what? Sorry, what was the what of many hats?
Successor to Ferrier as mayor.
Oh, mayor.
Oh,
yeah.
Seems to be his exact opposite.
Right. Yeah. Well,
was,
yeah.
Ferrier was a scoundrel and Mills was the saint.
Oh yeah. Well, no, this is it. There was actually election irregularity. I'm not quite sure what the nature of it was, but Ferrier stepped down. I don't think in disgrace. He must have had some excuse, but yeah, no. And John Easton Mills stepped in, and politically very different. And Mills, of course, his career was cut short when he had the nobility, if not the good sense, to go down to the docks when thousands of Irish immigrants sick with typhus were dying on the beaches, and he, along with many other Montrealers, helped them out, and of course contracted the disease himself and died. Which I mean, I think Fergus Keys is still here. He will give you any other details of that sad but inspiring story that a public figure would risk his life to save others is unfortunately not something that we hear about all that often. So yeah, you wouldn't have caught Ferrier doing anything of that sort. No, he was. I don't know exactly. I mean, I can guess he was what he was doing that was so corrupt, but he was also a great fixer. He kept coming in. I mean, McGill was in a sad state, and he came in and took over the running of it. He stepped down in 1852 when Charles Dewey Day, the judge, became, for various reasons, he ceded the position to Charles Dewey Day, who went on to be the president of McGill until his own death in 1882 or something like that, or 4. At which point Ferrier, who was then 84, took over again. He came back into the same office and became the president of McGill, until the chancellor, they called it at that point, until 1888 when he died. So yeah, I mean, stuff going on. But again, what struck me looking at this is, and it's hard to get at that without giving you boring lists, but the same people are sitting on all of these boards at different times, and they sort of change hats. One year it's somebody, the president, and somebody else. They, to give them credit, they wanted to get things done, and they cut corners, and they got to the point, and they did these things. Case in point being the dispute with the city, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Rod, we have a couple questions from Facebook I want to pass your way. Actually, this is one I wondered about. This is from Jacques Thibault, and he was wondering about that depression I think you mentioned in the 1870s. What was the cause of that depression?
Well, it was an international depression all around the Western world. Some people have argued that it was as debilitating in its way as the depression of the 1930s. I couldn't tell you exactly how it starts. I mean, my economics is a little weak, but yeah, no, it led to unemployment and businesses failing, and it went on for most of the decade. I suppose you could argue that the whole national policy that comes in at the end of the decade helps out, but I guess that would, again, I shouldn't speculate on that. But it was an international phenomenon, and it probably deserves to be labeled as, that's the thing, and then everything else sort of falls into place. I kind of bring it in. Oh, by the way, there was a depression, but it was quite devastating for for people all over the world. And Montreal was had a bit of a depression in the 1840s, in the late 1840s, and when it got into industrialization in the 50s, it was rolling. And so this whole period that I'm focusing on in the 1860s, this is boom time, and then everything collapses in the 70s, and then sort of slowly comes out. So yeah, I can't tell you more about that, but it's we should know more about it. It's something we should.
It's the forgotten depression.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
I have there's another one from Vicky Nufriu, and she was asking if you noticed a direct, I guess it's a general question, asking about if you saw a direct connection between arts, culture, and the elites, and wondering if the elites just had a better chance of realizing their artistic ambitions or cultural ambitions.
Well, yeah. If you mean like they're the ones with money, and they're the ones with influence, and they're the ones with connections, so they're getting things done. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's no question about that. I don't exactly know how the art, I mean, in terms of art, whether the artists fit into that, because there is kind of it's the kind of thing that's hard to pick up on, but you get a sense that in forming the art association, artists are very present, and then they slowly seem to not be visible on the at the leadership level. And I'm thinking that clearly this is the collectors and what I call the amateur connoisseurs, people like the bishop, who are kind of, I don't know, taking over maybe too strong, but they sort of naturally start running things, and the artists who really want this to work, because this is an occasion for them to show their stuff, but I guess they're less inclined to rock the boat, sort of thing. But I mean, the image we have of starving artists, this isn't necessarily the case. A lot of these guys, made a decent living. I didn't mention James Duncan, who was one of the spearheaders of the 1847 movement that seems to have been artists themselves who were running it. And he's a very interesting artist, and well, there's all kinds of things that he was involved in. If you've ever read Hochelaga Depicta, that source from 1839, talking about all kinds of aspects of Montreal institutions and society and stuff, he did all the illustrations for that. So he's somebody I use a lot to illustrate. But he was a teacher at the high school. He taught art at the high school, just like Fowler that I mentioned taught music at the high school. So these are not guys at the top of the pile, but they're guys that that people would know about because their kids, they were their kids' teachers and kind of thing. So that's yeah.
Right.
Rod, I was interested in Mr. Ferrier being able to purchase an Egyptian mummy quite so easily. Was that a thing in the day? Were other mummies brought over to Montreal that you know of as well?
Well, he presumably bought 3 back or 2. There may be another one that came later. I was first exposed to that working on this project you may have heard of called the 100 Objects in Quebec. And that's where I was talking to the curator that I mentioned there. I mean, this is itself an interesting topic that we're kind of dealing with as a society now, or certainly as a museum community. These objects that should remain in collections of this sort? Should they be sent back to where they came from? And I guess a lot depends on the relative dubiousness of the acquisition. There's this evidence from, it's not actually his record, it's the friend he was traveling with who wrote the account, but they seem to have run into this guy who was the local consul, which sounds like an official. Maybe he was an official, but he was clearly at least on the side doing some kind of a trade in artifacts. Whether the presence of a local person facilitating outsiders collecting the stuff excuses it or not is something, I guess, for us to talk about. But clearly he's a bit of a shady character. But then Ferrier was, let's say, shady. But I think, his heart was in the right place in the sense that he felt this is an institution, the Natural History Museum, that is not new, but it has taken a step forward, it has taken a step uptown, it is opening the new, and it should have a a centerpiece of some note. So that's what he did, but he just had it sent back, which and there was controversy too. I mean, there were people in town, in the press anyway, who said this is not appropriate to have this kind of thing in a natural history museum. So even at the time, they felt that. Although I think they were also speaking from a certain level of, well, jealousy or just always, there were certain people that were always going to be snippy about what this largely Anglo-Protestant organization was going to do. They're saying that the museum should stop having these trinkets, on display, and that's not wrong, because is a mummy an appropriate thing to have in a natural history museum? I don't know. I mean, you do tend to see them there, but anyway. But
Yeah.
I don't know of any others. But I mean, presumably they were trafficking all over the world.
Yeah.
So I mean, there must have been others that came to Canada, because there are other places in Canada that have mummies. But again, I mean, Redpath Museum is always cited as the oldest museum of that sort in Canada, but there was one even earlier, which was kind of its antecedent in a way. So the mummy, in fact, was back there. Mummy went to Redpath, and the Scobolus went to the Art Association. I don't know whether you can. Well, I don't think anyone bothers now. This is a plaster cast. It's much ado about nothing.
Do we have any more questions from anyone? If you do, if you have a question, just you can unmute yourself and your video as well, so I know that you'd like to ask a question. I see Fergus Keys has revealed himself.
That's it. No, it was just one small point I wanted to add about Ferrier and John Mills, sometimes called the martyr mayor. John Mills actually won the election from Ferrier. That's how he became, and Ferrier was the incumbent. John Mills actually got 10 votes. Ferrier got 9 votes. But somewhere within the city regulation at that time, because he was an incumbent, he could vote for himself twice, which he automatically did. So Ferrier went and voted for himself twice. It went on for 3 months, these continuous arguments, until somebody switched over and supported John Mills, allowing him to become mayor, and fortunately then helping the Irish in dying. But just kind of shows you a little bit about Ferrier too,
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that makes sense. I just noticed a reference to him leaving in the middle of the term, and I wasn't quite sure how to account for that. And it's something to do with voting, but I thought that they maybe thought it was irregular and gone back and counted it or something. So that's good to know. So if it hadn't happened, then he would still have been mayor, and well, maybe John Mills would have gone down anyway, but to help.
Yeah, Ferrier, I don't think so.
No, he wouldn't. I don't think so. No, I don't think so. No, he wouldn't have. He would have gone off looking for mummies.
I see Lauren has a question.
Yeah.
Yes, I must say, first of all, I really enjoyed the talk and feel like I learned a lot.
Oh, thank you.
I really think it's very interesting to situate it in this idea of the transition to the new town and everything like that. This is an idea that I hadn't really even thought about before, and it's just so illuminating to look at it in that context. And I was just thinking back to the way that you began the talk when you were talking about Samuel Butler's quotation about oh God, oh Montreal, and everything like that. And at the same time, we're hearing, that the Art Association was one of the first art associations, not only in Canada, but I mean, even in relation to a number of the cities in the northeastern United States, and had the first permanent galleries. And then the Natural History Museum had the first galleries that you just mentioned, and so on. And I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on how Montreal compared to other cities of its size in, say, northeastern United States, and Toronto, I guess, would be about the only other comparison. How would you situate Montreal? Was it such a? It doesn't sound like it was such a backwater compared to for the other cities of its size.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that depends on where you come from and what you're used to, and I think in Butler's case, it depends on the sort of the agenda that you have, the point you're trying to make. I think I can't remember what which actual book he was working on, but he endlessly lampooned Victorians, and I think he made a lot of this up, this encounter that he had, because he says things about the curator who was stuffing the owl that don't make sense to me. I think it's quite reasonable to compare Montreal at this time with all kinds of cities in the Northeast United States and even in England. I mean, not London, obviously, but if you compare it to Manchester and Birmingham and or Glasgow and places like that, which are more industrialized by that time than Montreal is. But if you look at their activity, there's an interesting, lot of interesting work being written about some of the public institutions that are taking place in some of these cities, buildings that are often still around, and the Pride. St. George's Hall in Manchester, I think, is a civic building of some sort. The other thing I would say is that as far as sort of cutting edge, I think Montreal was a smaller and less sophisticated city than, say, Boston or New York. But it was, I think it got some of these institutions going earlier. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts, for example, if I remember correctly, and I haven't put this to memory, but started earlier, but it made its big move out to brand new facilities in Copley Square. It's not there anymore. Of course, it's moved further out in the early 20th century to its present location. But I think it did that in the early 70s. And I mean, the Metropolitan Museum in New York was a little bit late. I think it was the 80s before it was set up in its present location. Again, these are all sort of, well, the equivalent of Newtown, if you like. And they had more money. They had more connections around the world. Rich Americans traveling at this time were buying all kinds of stuff from Europe. Again, you can read descriptions of what they were picking up in terms of European paintings, even early Impressionists and so on. So it's on a different scale, but maybe not as early as Montreal. So there's something to be said for the innovation going on here. As I say, small scale, but nothing to shake a stick at, I don't think.
Great, thank you. Well, Rod, I think that is the end of all the questions this evening. So I'd like to thank you very much. We'll bring the evening to a close, and by saying thank you to all the guests who came along on Zoom and on Facebook as well. And please check out our Heritage Line series online at the Facebook page or at quan.org for more information. Hopefully we'll see you next week. Again, thank you, Rod, for a really fascinating discussion. We could keep you going all night, probably with questions, but we'll let you rest now. Thank you, Glenn and Master Control, for all of your help. And thank you, everyone. Stay safe and good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.